Good evening, and a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Melissa McRobert, and I'm the Deputy Director of Talbot Rice Gallery, and it is my huge pleasure this evening to introduce you to Lawrence Abu Hamdan and to Jessie Jones, and our dear colleague Hepzibah Israel, who's also exhibiting at Talbot Rice, and that the receptions will take place immediately after this event, so I hope you can all join. A little introduction. Jessie Jones's practice is multiform, working in film installation, performance, and sculpture. Using a form of expanded cinema, Jessie explores magical counter-narratives to the state, drawn from suppressed archetypes and myth. Jessie represented Ireland at the Venice Biennale in 2017 with the work Tremble, Tremble, which has since toured globally, and some of you may have even seen it at Talbot Rice in 2018. At Talbot Rice this evening, you will experience The Tower, the second part in a trilogy beginning with Tremble, Tremble, which conjures the words of women burned as heretics before the first witch trials in the 16th century. And for over a decade, Lawrence Abu Hamdan's internationally acclaimed practice has centred on what he calls forensic listening, by documenting and analysing sound, using video installation and live performance, testifying to the political significance and legal implication of sound. Lawrence's work has been presented in the form of forensic reports, films, exhibitions, and live performances, which most recently he was presenting last week in New York at MoMA. At Talbot Rice, we are very proud to present 45th Parallel. Shot in the only cross-border theatre in the world, the work speaks of the absurd, porous, and contradictory nature of borders, and the laws that govern these grey areas, often with lethal effect. Enough of me. You're here to see Jessie and Lawrence, and I've got the very wonderful James Clegg, our curator at Talbot Rice, who's going to be DJing this evening. Big clap for them, please.
Hi Liz, yes, thanks for joining us. We really are in the sort of sweaty heart of the law school tonight, so I think that's a really appropriate context for this conversation because both Jessie and Lawrence have made artworks that engage with the law, and they both have practices that really push the boundaries of what art can achieve, that really have real-world consequences. We often say as an art gallery that we're trying to make exhibitions that speak to the national conversation, that speak to issues that are really having an effect on people's lives. And I think tonight's a great opportunity to explore what we mean by that. I imagine in the structure of this short talk being a bit like a triangle, and we'll start with the foundations, the base, and ask some quite general questions, and then we'll lead towards the point, which is the specific artworks that you're going to see in the gallery straight after the talk. So Jessie, I'm going to start with you. If we could say that the Repeal the Eighth Amendment campaign and the significant political change in Ireland that accompanied it was the moment for Tremble, Tremble, what would you say is the moment for the Tower?
Yeah, it's a good question. I suppose the initial kind of murmurings or rumblings of the Tower actually kind of originated in Scotland, actually. And I was researching the history of Magdalene asylums. Obviously, Magdalene asylums are very significant in Irish history, as some of you are aware. But I was looking at kind of parallel moments and looking towards the Maryhill Asylum in Glasgow, and I was really captured by the story of the escape from Maryhill in the late 1950s. And it just presented this story that I hadn't heard, which was they got out, they escaped, and they dispersed into the city. And, you know, there hasn't been the same kind of state apology here as there has been in Ireland, but there's also a sense that there's this other version of the story that we're given about the Magdalenes and that moment of incarceration. And I had been working as helping as a scribe to the Dublin Remembers Magdalene project, which was bringing together survivors and then telling their stories that we would hold in an archive. And from that experience, I was so struck by the really intense pathos of hearing the testimony of women who were talking about when they were teenagers, and they were only telling that story when they were in their 70s and even older. And it was absolutely so powerfully heartbreaking, of this kind of, you know, this sense of like epistemic injustice that we're only hearing this story at this point. So it made me really want to work with teenagers and kind of imagine the voices coming from teenage bodies. So the kind of energy of the Palestrina Girls Choir became the heart of the collaboration, and it's great to see Blonnet and Jermaine here from Dublin. So it was kind of that teenage energy that really started it off. And then again, the pandemic hit, and I became absolutely fascinated with anchorites and women that immured themselves into walls and kept themselves in isolation. And I was fascinated by what that did to the female imaginary in that space. So that was basically my pandemic time, was like reading loads of Julian F. Norwich and loads of Hildegard of Bingen and lots of anchorite texts. So in a way, it's kind of about like what are some of the parallels between isolation and incarceration, and what kind of imaginaries are also possible that can kind of creep through that space.
And I think some of this history is quite hidden and not talked about a lot. So for people who don't know what the Magdalene Asylums were, could you give us a short description of that?
Yeah, I mean, the Magdalene Asylums, they happened all across Europe. They kind of rose in the mid to late 19th century, emerging from the Contagious Diseases Acts, but in particular Ireland really took off with Magdalene laundries after the 1930s, after our counter-revolution, and women were incarcerated from a really young age for like particularly not very intense reasons, but they were imprisoned in these kind of forced labour camps up until the mid-1990s. So we've had a lot of tribunals in Ireland in the last couple of decades that really explored that, and it's only been very recently that some of the stories of survivors have really come to the public eye, or the public ear rather.
And I think we already get the sense that with your practice, you're spanning these long periods of time from, you know, centuries-old history through to recent events. With Tremble Tremble, you went back to the witch trials, and with the Tower, you're going even further back to the 12th century. Why do you think it's important to try and bridge these past and present moments?
Yeah, it's like I kind of have this feeling that, like, you know, everyday life actually is at least 500 years in the making. So, you know, how we inhabit like every moment of everyday life has so many kind of legacies and layers and sedimentations to the relational, political and legal qualities of how we got there. So I'm really fascinated as an artist by kind of digging through that kind of sedimentation. The 12th century is just this incredible moment of effervescence in female theological imaginary. And in the film, I'm really drawn to a woman called Marguerite Porete, who I haven't actually heard of until the last couple of years. And I was just so struck by her story because she wrote a book, which some of you might know, called The Mirror of Simple Souls. And when she was executed in 1311, she had copies of the book strapped to her body. So this sense of like the words burning, the body burning, this sense of like injustice that her name and her work was forgotten. But she was, you know, executed in such a public way in the 12th century. So just thinking about like, or the 14th century, but just thinking about, you know, how these things get forgotten and what does it mean to re-enter memory, and particularly through people's work, you know, through like hearing again the voice, hearing again the words of these mystics. I think is, for me, it was very powerful. It kind of got me through lockdown anyway.
So Lawrence, to bring you into the conversation and also to bring us back to being in the law school, you were there at the founding of Forensic Architecture, and I know that you now run an NGO called Earshot, and I'm going to read the description of what that does, but it's an investigative agency that employs cutting-edge audio analysis techniques on behalf of people affected by corporate, state, and environmental violence. And as we explained in the exhibition guide, your work has been used in real-world legal cases. So I wonder if based upon your experience, you could tell us how you view the relationship between art and the law.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the relationship between art and the law is not so. I try not to formalize it so much in what I do, because I think they're just there are these kind of barriers that you meet within each forum that you enter. Barriers to discourse, barriers to the sort of ways in which we can imagine and perceive and actually speak and talk to structural and environmental and corporate violence. And when each one of those kind of thresholds is exceeded in one forum, it's time to move it to another and sort of experiment with ways in which those can be recast to adequate ways that meet the kind of political demands that we're exploring. So in that sense, I see it more as a kind of continuation of a practice that is deeply curious about the kind of stories sound can tell, the kind of things you can pull out from sound, and the way that sort of shift in the kind of weight of perception changes a whole set of questions that we have to ask of the way in which we conduct politics, in which we listen to each other, And so while a forensic report or a testimony or a video that's describing a particular incident has one kind of language and is made for one kind of aesthetic regime, it doesn't mean that that those same kind of curiosities are not born when it comes to the work in the gallery. So for me, whether or not it's an artwork, whether or not it's a forensic report, I mean, all of these things aren't necessarily, I think, up for debate. And a debate that maybe is the least interesting part of it, right? Whether or not it is any of those things. But I think if you follow the sort of trajectory and the sort of investigative inquiry through all the works and through the multiple lives that these works have, whether it's on a web-based platform for an advocacy NGO, or whether it's in a gallery, or whether it's in a courtroom, each, you would find that kind of, you would understand why it's in that space and why it also needs to kind of exceed it and kind of move outside of it. Yeah. And I think maybe it's kind of elusive to people what it is that I'm talking about, what it is that I do when I say about sort of audio analysis. But essentially, you have to understand is that all of this material that's going on in the open source today, people pulling out their phones, filming incidents, a lot of that is sound recordings. Very little of that, is happening in front of the camera in the time and in the place. And what you usually have is some kind of trace of the event, acoustic trace that kind of leak onto the camera, or it's, in a recent project that was all about the Israeli military aircraft in Lebanon. So, it's literally people putting their phone to the sky and hearing the sky rumble. You don't see the aircrafts themselves. So I think over time there's been as I've been working with sort of picking out, significances from echoes, from electromagnetic interference, from things that would normally be considered noise. Over time, it's there's a greater cognizance in the field of human rights to understand the kind of stories that you can tell with a sound recording and the kind of things you can extract from sound. So that's how and where I've sort of been developing. And I think while there's been a lot of sort of expertise in that field that, been asked and are, people who come in and give expert testimony in court, the field of open source work where you're pulling videos and you're sent things and the codecs are all different and the frame rates are all different and the sample rates are in all of the, it's this kind of it's the opposite of a laboratory kind of conditions. The way you work with that mess and that noise and with this sort of, the way you lead into the noise rather than necessarily the signal, those techniques are the ones that, myself and my colleagues have specifically been developing. So I think that is a legacy from, in a way, tuning into things like experimental music or sound art or these kind of practices, expanding the horizons of listening from spaces of art and music into these other fields. So I think these things are shared. spread across. Yeah, I don't know if that.
No, that's good. I mean, we work in a university context, and I think we can see that people quite quickly defer to a scientist or a legal expert in a room because they're seen as figures of authority. But I think you maybe see the hierarchies between art and a legal situation quite differently.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a limited, the question of the expert is kind of limited to answering specific questions that are asked of it. And I think what we're trying to do with Earshot is really build a kind of greater understanding of how can listening or changing the way we listen be able to inform a new kind of political understanding of an event. And so, there's a very clear example of that. The very first case I ever worked on, it was for this accent analyses that were being done by 2 asylum seekers who were coming to this country. And they were using the accent in absence of the passport or a legal document. And so they would bring in these experts, these sociolinguists and all these people, and they would say, well, this phoneme is from South Somalia, and this one is actually a Kenyan word, and so, but this person claims he's from Mogadishu, so we deny the asylum, right? He's not from where he claims to be from. And in a way that was true, what they were saying, that is true, that word was from here, and that sentence was from here. But what I was coming in doing was say, well, wait a minute, if we actually listen to that voice as a voice that's a life of itinerancy, and actually potentially rather than see these kind of deficiencies in an accent or these discrepancies in the way they speak as a need to deny people, that actually that is a product of the need for asylum. It is in itself a call for asylum in that accent itself, if you just change the way you listen to it, right? And both of those things were true. One is an expert coming in and ask those questions. They're equally true, right? But it's about sort of trying to reframe the way in which these habits of listening are conducted, and to try and listen in a way that I feel is more continuous to the way in which sound propagate, the way in which accents are contagious, the way in which these things are all made in kind of relation. Rather than always to trying to isolate something and kind of make it a distinct article of scrutiny, but really to see, to think sonically, to think with the way in which sound spills across a room and leaks out of walls, stuff like that, and have that be the kind of basis through which, claims are made, rather than, the more conventional ways in which evidence is derived. Yeah.
Great. I think the way that your work brings us closer to events and witnesses, it got me thinking about that idea of witnessing, Jesse, and how I think through your practice you ask us to become witnesses. We become witnesses to a history that's perhaps been lost through time or willfully obscured or deleted. And I wonder if you could tell us how you use your artwork to bring us closer to these figures and periods of time.
I suppose, witness is obviously a word that it changes from our view of spectatorship, and I think it's very powerful what you're saying, Lawrence, about the kind of the sense that the ear has all this other potential to the eye, and I think the sense of like the relationship between the body and witnessing, rather than just spectatorship, rather than just images. So for me, like, as somebody who worked in moving image for so long, I was very conscious that I wanted to expand that experience for an audience to have a more embodied feeling in relationship to moving image, and for it to be something that, happens in the dark, performance emerges. There's a sense that your whole body is taken up into a 360 kind of spheric kind of space. So in a way that is not dissimilar to how we perceive the world, and as a phenomenon of being, of sensing. So a more kind of expanded sensory experience. But again, a lot of the stories that I'm telling through my work, you don't have to know all the exact things to experience the work, because you should feel it. I think one of the problems that I had for so long with work, with making work that was political in its storytelling, was how to embroil people into the experience of feeling an effective position in relationship to those stories. And it was something that kind of happens in the last couple of years for me, where I kind of shifted in my practice to I remember saying this, that I want to make work from the neck down. I want to be able to think and research, but then feel it and then allow it to flow and be an unconscious thing. And it was when I was reading about how Hildegard of Bingen had, in her 40s, started having these intense visions, that I just thought, there is something about that. There is something where art transitions into another space, and this kind of effectual, instinctual, unconscious feeling happens. And for me, as an artist making work that has a political context for many years, it just kind of switched for me in the last couple of years, where I wanted to feel it as well as understand and think it, because I felt that there was a sense that the world informatically is so chaotic and cacophonous right now, and the texture by which we approach reality, I feel there's something for the space of art, like Lawrence is saying, around the ear being given more privilege, the body being given more privilege in a way that isn't just about this kind of visual cultural kind of enclosure that we have with reality that's really visual and orthodox. So kind of dispersing and spreading of that as a different type of witnessing.
Does that resonate with you, Lawrence?
Yeah, I think so. I think, it's clearly, I think, one of the remits of people who are producing cultural work is to experiment with the ways in which we encounter these events, right? And the way in which they're historicized, and to not be satisfied with the sort of means by which these things are often presented. And I think clearly, actually I kind of disagree that I don't think we're living in a cacophonous time at all. I think we're living in a very loud but deeply homogeneous, where it's the same noise that is coming out. And I think there is a necessity to kind of maybe make it a bit more cacophonous in a way.
Like more polyphonic.
Yeah, more polyphonic. And to try to recast some of the ways in which we listen and encounter events, and listen to people as well. And sometimes that can be counterintuitive, the idea of a kind of the ethics by which you would put someone in a mid-shot and you would listen to their testimony about what happened to them. That may not be the best way of giving someone voice. Maybe sometimes it might actually be to mute them entirely. Maybe that's the way you need to give someone voice. Right? All of these questions are a question of a kind of aesthetic intervention, but I think are ripe with, politics. Of course, those decisions can be, politically harmful, but they could also potentially do something else, right? And I think that that's a space that we need to experiment with more.
Great. If you think we live in a cacophonous world, you can shout at the end of the talk, and if you don't, you can just sit there quietly, and we'll figure out through that voting mechanism. So with the tower, Jesse, you're looking at as the work of 12th to 14th century female mystics. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about why it's important to look at these figures and what you gain from thinking about their lives.
I suppose what I found really inspiring about them was, after looking at the period of the witch trials for so long in my work, I felt totally exhausted by the archetype of this kind of dark feminine, and I was really taken by the idea to re-enter that story from a different place. So looking at the kind of early stages of looking at the work of Marguerite Porete, I really identified her as this kind of hinge between the heresy trials, the witch trials, and the mystical figure. And I think it's a part of the story that, as feminists, it's really important to recuperate that story, that there was this huge potential in this period before the rise of the witch trials and the rise of religious patriarchy, that women had this agency, they had this ability to tell stories, to form their own monasteries, to live as beguines, to live in isolation. And there was this other, I guess, a kind of heterotopic possibility. So for me in my work, I've always been fascinated by those little hinge moments, that things, if you flip it, it could have went totally otherwise. Like that moment of, actually, there's the exact moment where there's a portal that it could have been a different thing. And I've always been fascinated. And as soon as I find a little thread like that as an artist, I'll just keep pulling at that until, it's just really exciting. But then it's also deeply, I guess, filled with sadness and pathos that otherwise possibility has a kind of mirror to what we ended up with in reality. So I guess playing as well with history, playing with chronological history, playing with time. One of the things that I really enjoy doing within my practice, I suppose I studied as a sculptor originally, and I really enjoy playing with the plastic materiality of chronological time, of imagining that, something in the 12th century is as significant to what we experience in time right now. That there's something in the idea, in particular, the words of Marguerite Perret that you will hear in the film installation when she talks about shame. And a lot of the 12th century mystical thinkers were obsessed with shame. They were so anti-shame. They knew that we were being sold some kind of false goods with the shame thing. They knew it was on the rise, and they knew we have to stop this. And the way that we will stop it is we will have these really intense devotional visions about Christ. And he will tell us that shame doesn't exist. Don't mind them priests, don't mind them bishops. There's no such thing as shame. And I'm joking about it, but that's the reason why Marguerite Perret was burnt at the stake, was because she literally said, there can be no shame. So I feel that unraveling shame, for me as an Irish woman, it's really powerful. But unraveling shame is pulling that back and just even thinking about it forensically. How does it manifest? What are the aesthetics of it? How does it affect the body? So it's kind of thinking about its relationship to the epistemic justice that we have now is connected to all of these historical sedimentations, I feel,
Great, thanks. And Lawrence, so we can get into the threads of the 45th parallel. Could you give us a couple of brief examples of the kind of legal cases that you visit within the work, but maybe specifically tell us how you uncovered them and how you became interested in them?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting to hear Jesse speak is that there is also that in this work, there's a moment where things could have been otherwise. And partly that's also the point, right? We need to make reality. We don't, we need to, that's I think why I'm kind of interested in those moments. Not to accept reality, but to try to make it. And I think what's interesting about the Supreme Court precedents is that they're always contingent on seemingly disparate and strange stories. So if you follow a kind of story through the Supreme Court, and in this case, I mean in the US, because of the precedent system, it's like reading an incredible novel where suddenly something will happen with British Petroleum in Nigeria that will affect a search and seizure case in some nowhere place in Nevada, which then goes to a kind of, cross-killing case in the Mexican border, right? And these things which seemingly have no real, meaning to one another in any other way, and you'd never find them sort of congregated, start to come to network to them, start to actually become part of an architecture. I think showing that architecture is part of what this film is about. I mean, quite literally, it's about this Haskell Free Library and Opera House, which is on the border of Vermont and United States. And you'll see all about it in the piece. Fireworks are they're there. It's all there for you to see. There's nothing hidden. It's there, whether you like it or not, you're going to hear about it. Yeah, so, but I found it interesting because then that's actually where the title comes from, 45th parallel, because it is about this potential parallel universe that this kind of moment could open up in this exception. Okay, what was the question? Should I say something else about?
I think you sort of touched on it, just how you uncover the things that you're interested in, these specific legal cases.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's following those threads, as Jesse said, and being attuned to the thread rather than the sort of thing that it's knotted to, and sort of understanding those lives in relation rather than them as singular things. So I think that's one of the ways I've always tried to work, and that's also something I attribute to kind of thinking sonically, Even though this film is not about sound, it is about a certain kind of impossibility to sort of, it's very concerned with the threshold and with the ways in which things leak and cracks and things can break through.
Now, this isn't a tribunal, so you can freely answer or interpret the questions as you choose. Yeah, they're very serious out there. Yeah. So in the brief snapshot, we've got a good practice, and when we see the work up in the gallery, we encounter philosophical ideas, political subject matters, legal systems, questions about borders, jurisdictions, policing, reflections on what constitutes a trial, evidence, testimony. We visit geopolitical conflict zones, colonial mapping, and contemporary military operations. And this is a 15-minute film. So I thought it would be a good question to ask you about how you take all these things that interest you and you find a way to make them into a compelling art form.
Well, yeah, I think it's about trying to see things in relation, as I said before. Like, it wasn't that I set out to make a film about one thing. It's that when it started to become three things, that's when I knew it was a film, if you see what I mean. So it's in that kind of excess, and it's in the way in which things bleed onto each other and leak onto each other. And, I also find, it's also about the form and the concision and the 15 minutes. That's like something I think is also from music, You got 30 minutes maximum, you got 5 songs, do it, it's over, And I've always worked like that from like playing music into today. I think that it's also, I really like the sort of performance to camera. I like writing the sort of script and the monologues and the way in which what you can do with that and how you can modulate intensity and the way you can sort of unfold narratives in that form is really something I've tried to hone over the last years. And so that's what I'm glad to hear you think it's in there.
It's all in
there.
Yeah. Well, you described it, I think, to our volunteer team as you sort of write verbal essays, and I think you have an interest in pushing your work more towards being performance-based.
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's also just much more, there's just this immediacy that comes with it. And though that I see that as a performance to camera. We had 18 hours to shoot it because of the restrictions of using that space and filming in it. And it's literally like a US border guard. It's really under siege, that whole site. So we had 18 hours and we just slammed it out, And I think if we'd had, 2 weeks, it would have been a way worse document, I think there's something nice about sort of working to this sort of energy that comes through a performance and locking it down to camera was really the the skill of the cinematographer Jared Alterman, who actually works to capture performance in that way in live performance. And he's someone I've worked with before. And, this is the second film where, there's performances I do, these live audio essays I do, which that can happen anywhere. I could do one right now if you wanted me to. But there's also these films which are the same format, but they're shot in a specific site, and they're an exploration of a specific site, and they demand the scenography that only that site provides. And I think 45th parallel is in that second category. Yeah.
Fabulous, thanks. I think it would be great to leave a little bit of time for a couple of questions from the audience. I wonder if before we go to that, Jesse, if there's anything else you'd like to tell people about what they will encounter with the tower.
I don't want to reveal too much. I suppose what you will encounter is a lot of darkness, so I hope you're okay with going into a dark space. It unfolds, so I guess I'm quite interested in the dark because I feel like a lot of interesting things can happen in the dark. So just be prepared to allow for that darkness and trust that we won't do anything scary.
It's pretty scary.
I'll extend that to you, Lawrence. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the 45th parallel before people encounter the work?
Yeah, I mean, there's some... Yeah. It's all there. There's the main performer is Mahdi Fleifel, who's a filmmaker in his own right. And his performance is a kind of Easter egg of sorts, because if you know his films, which are accessible on Netflix and everything else, then you'd have a sense of why he's that voice and his relationship to that very border that he's sort of describing through the voice of others.
Great. So we've got time for about 2 or 3 questions. If you want to put your hand up, we'll get the microphone to you.
Straight away.
Hello. I was just wondering, well, we're in a total chaos space just now, and it feels like we're right on the precipice of like the collapse of the old and the start of the new, which is the Tower Tarot card, which is quite exciting. I was wondering if you came across like the battle between objective and subjective reality in the way we make sense of things in your forensic kind of like, bringing the art world and the world of law together. They're very, like, one is filled with curiosity and, the observation of things is very different. One seems to be, anyway, you know what I mean, don't you? Did you come across like a kind of, did you experience that real, resistance between, or the battle between what is objective and subjective reality?
Thing is, the thing about the law is it's not really very objective, is it? I mean,
no,
yeah. So I'm not sure if I'd even cast it in that kind of diametric sort of opposition, where one is sort of the subject and one is of the object. I think that I would more like to think about them as places with, almost just as well regulated, codified principles of the ways in which things and stories emerge. And I think it's interesting to sort of use one in the other. There are, of course, kind of like illegal arguments I find myself using, and I find them really particularly useful outside of the court system, right? And I think that, I did a investigation for Amnesty International on the prison of Saydnaya in the sort of like 30 kilometers north of Syria. In 2016, I'd interviewed these former detainees of this prison who had been blindfolded and kept in the dark, and their experience of the prison that they could testify to was ear witness testimony. So I was brought in to kind of create these dedicated ear witness interviews for them. And some of that work was really kind of, this is also a really long answer, but I'm going to do it anyway. You can shut me up. But some of that work was really, let's say, technical. It was about it was very specific. It was very precise. It was about locks. And from the sound of locks that were committed to memory, we could work out how many people had been held inside and work backwards from that. So some of that were part of a set of legal arguments that were incredibly important. Not even legal, but let's say within the world of advocacy, that could be used to argue for at that time, the sort of necessity to reject Bashar al-Assad as a kind of lesser evil at that time, which was what was going on. He's now also kind of returned as a lesser evil. But for that moment when the Saydnaya investigation came out, it didn't seem so clear to people that he was the less evil option. And it had it had large effects, but some of that work was also the really careful listening and re-listening and listening again to pieces of information which were not of the order of technical or precise information, but were products of the very means of the sensory deprivation that these people lived through. And in a law court, they would have been thrown out because they were factually, physically inaccurate statements. But they were some of the most lucid descriptions of that place happened in the breakdown of memory, in the impossibility to remember those sites. Because sort of encoded into those memories were the very violence that they were speaking about. So in a way, the memory was no longer simply a sort of a testimony of an event that they were speaking to, but a kind of matter, a piece of evidence itself, right? A kind of almost like an artifact that had emerged from that very crime scene. And so, there's often times where you're sort of moving into sort of illegal territory, and I think it's important to understand those thresholds. And that's, again, where we're going to start with the answer to James' question, is that it's really about modulating where those thresholds are in each of these kind of spaces, and seeing the kind of where the limits to these discourses emerge, and trying to speak to an event in the most comprehensive way possible.
Yeah, do you think that's like the metaphysical human experience rather than the logical, physical?
Yeah, again, I don't know what's logic, right? I mean, it's also like I don't know where to begin with these sort of oppositions in a way. That's why I'm giving these long answers. Maybe unsatisfactory, but that's what they have to be. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you another example that, just to show you when I was testifying in the court for the accent stuff, what I was talking about before, in the deportation hearings of asylum seekers, I got asked a question that was like, do you think, in your opinion, by the judge, he asked me, do you think, in your opinion, these accent tests should be thrown out entirely? And I was very flattered by this question. So I'm being asked the big questions, like they really take me seriously. And then, I answered in however I answered, and the lawyer came to me after, the defense lawyer who had actually asked me to testify. He said that he really didn't like that question. I asked him why. He said because he was essentially, this wasn't his words, but the judge was goading me at the kind of threshold of irrational and illegitimate speech. Had I said that this whole thing should be scrapped, it would cross the threshold from law into politics, right? And therefore, I would be considered an activist, and nothing I should say. I actually believe not only that policy should be scrapped, that the border itself should be scrapped. Yeah. So for them, and like completely wacko, right? Yeah. And so though we have this idea of a kind of like this free speech and the metaphysical and the logical and the illogical, right? I mean, in actual fact, the whole world is kind of governed by these sort of thresholds of what can be spoken, and what is speakable. And that's also true of the art space, 100%. But I think it's for me that, sort of almost like this judge always kind of goading at those thresholds of the speakable is really an important kind of place to learn from. So yeah, I would say that to say the border needs eradicating entirely is purely logic, But the judge would say that's a legal nonsense. So you know what I mean? It's This is not to give credence to the idea that there is a sort of floaty art world thing and a kind of very concrete legal world, right? The concrete is complete nonsense. And you're just like, what are you talking about? It's where they meet. And I think in the film you see, I'm constantly I'm trying to describe the border in its most absurd condition. It's actually hilarious. A border is hilarious. It's a hilarious thing. It's completely absurd. It's bizarre. but it's also entirely lethal. And there's whole regimes of violence that have emerged and technologies that have emerged that make sure that it's lethal and continue it and enforce its violence. So I think those things are of course always true, they're at the same time.
Okay, I think we'll save our chuckles and fear about borders just now, but if we get our timing right, you'll be the first people to enjoy the exhibitions across the road. So I just wonder if anyone got one more question for Jessie. Everyone believes in non-cacophony in this room, I think.
Oh, we didn't do the vote, though.
Oh, we do have a question at the front here.
Yeah, this is a question for Jessie. So, I mean, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen the films, but or the film, but it struck me that I have seen it, and I wondered if you could say a bit. You said a lot about the content, but I wonder if you could say a bit about the sort of maybe challenges in shooting, because the perspectives, the viewpoints in the film are quite sort of astounding. The sort of overviews or things floating, and how challenging it was to actually shoot different parts of it.
It wasn't challenging. I know I'm joking, but I don't know if Emma Dalesman is in the room at the moment, but I am very, very lucky. I collaborate with often the same people over and over again. I collaborate with Olwen Foray often, and I collaborate with Emma Dalesman, an amazing DOP. So I return to the same collaborators. So when we're in a room together, there's this strange kind of collective energy where we can almost read each other's minds. And I'll make some drawings, and I suppose what was different about this artwork than other artworks I've made is I spent a lot of time in my studio drawing every frame and making like collages and physically making the film on paper. And during lockdown, I was very devastated. I couldn't get to make films in the way I usually do with a crew and on a sound stage and everything. So I started to make little sculptural models, and I started to make physical, tangible things. So you'll see a lot of objects in the space this time, because the tactility of object making and drawing was really the beginning points. They were the first frames of the film. So the film is really connected to the physical aspects of the work as well. So we see Olwen in a sculpture as well as we see the same Olwen in the film. So for me, I wouldn't say it was challenging as much as an eruption of fun and joy. And I really, really in love. I'm sure you experience it as well, Lawrence, is when you're on a sound stage, or when you only have that 18-hour window, it's like the shortest amount of time, but it's also this like amazing cracking like possibility. If you're in the right room with the right people, it's just absolute like bliss heaven. It's strenuous and it's hard work, but it's just wonderful experience. So I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry if you wanted me to be more grim about the challenge. I was looking a lot at like Baldo drawings and Goya's drawings of when we see witches in flight, and I wanted to create that feeling for the spectator, that you're not just watching something on the ground, that it can feel like it's floating, it can feel like, a representation of a witch or mystic. So having that kind of destabilization of perspective for the viewer, I feel like it makes you feel the relationship with what's happening on screen, rather than just seeing it as a representation. So I think that's the challenge. The challenge was to bring people into a little bit of a spin with using camera work. It's the first time I've used digital post-production in my artwork ever. I have always shot everything religiously in camera, but during lockdown I had made so many collages and drawings. I was like, this is a moment to try and do some digital manipulation, because it's just a collage. It's not this really scary, intimidating thing. It's collage. So that's what I tried to do.
So I think it's been it's incredible to hear brilliant artists talk about their practices and to be in their company. And I think you'll get a similar sensation from reading the words of Hepzibah Israel, who's in the room and who has the third exhibition over at the gallery. I think before we move off and I just tell you which way to head, we should give Lawrence and Jesse a huge round of applause.